Hi, Misha here, and yes, I'm still on vacation, but you know how I do. I still like to post a video or two every week just to make sure you don't completely forget about me. Sometimes it's older stuff that just never got published, and sometimes it's just things that popped up, like today's topic. Well, a little while ago, did a video that I had a lot of fun doing, although I know it's a very niche topic, talking about bayonets for the British Lee Enfield No.4 Mark 1, and for that matter, Mark 1 Star and Mark 2 series. Bolt action 303 rifles from World War II in Korea. And we looked at the bayonets, the No.4, and the No.9. But when I did that earlier video, I didn't have but two No.4 spikers. But then I stumbled into a couple local. So I've got a decent little layout here. We got 4 on the table, plus one more we'll look at, including some kind of neat variations. And I just felt like talking about it. So this is just a very informal hangout talking about Enfields. But yeah, we'll be back from vacation at the beginning of September, still doing cabin work. And if you'd like to help with the channel, always check out Patreon, or liking, sharing, subscribing, and tuning into the live streams when we get back to doing them. That helps too. Just a quick little refresher on the Enfield No.4. This rifle is actually a very long time in coming, with its roots going all the way back to the P14, later in 1926 renamed the No.3, because of its peep sight, which led to the SMLE Mark V trials rifles between 1922 and 1924, which didn't really go much of anywhere, but they go to the No.1 Mark VI in the early 30s for trials. And then finally in 1939, this pattern was officially finalized and adopted, although because of war, it wasn't really put into production until 1941 after the Battle of Dunkirk and the evacuation. So much was in need. And actually, BSA would set up a whole new production line at Shirley, Maltby, and for Zakerley would begin manufacturing these as well, the original No.4 Mark 1 here. And the idea was to deliver better durability with the furniture, modernize the manufacturing of the receiver, make it a more solid thing. And they went to a slightly longer, heavier barrel that was almost free-floated. And of course, the big deal was the rear sight. This is my British example with a stamped rear sight. There's multiple variations of this sight. Mark 3, Mark 4, Mark 3 Star. Yeah. And you can tell this is a Mark 1 because it has the spring-loaded bolt release, but the 10-round mag and the bolt system itself is still very standard, although they did go to a much stronger furniture. I should also point out that for wartime they went to a alloy called Zamac for the butt plate, and you'll see various stamped parts on and off, including barrel bands, front sight protector, wartime economies. But one of the big deals here was going away from the classic 1907 bayonet and going to a simple socket style. This was done to save on weight and also cost, because they were adding some length and weight to the barrel, so it's save out there. But it's kind of interesting because this is kind of a reversion to a very old school type of bayonet. Socket bayonets were more the thing in the 19th century. Of course, they just simply snap on the barrel. This is a No.4 Mark II bayonet with a No.4 Mark I scabbard and removable hanger. This would by far be the most common produced scabbard, but there would be others. And this was the second pattern of the bayonet. The initial pattern had a cruciform pig sticker bayonet, where it had grooves cut. Now, the spike itself is 8 inches and about 10 inches with the socket. That length was picked during trials in the late 30s. It was just about as small as they could go and still be somewhat useful in combat. Here it is. Very easy to snap these on. Little more fiddly to take them off. In the past, I did have a No. 4 Mark I with the cruciform, but frankly, they just got to be too valuable and I sold it. And the only difference is the lack of the grooves. And that was done to save on time and machining, and it actually saved on a lot. Anywhere from 30 to 40% of the machining, they realized with this, was putting those cruciform grooves in. So they just stopped. Otherwise, they're the same bayonet, really. You just press in about a quarter turn rotation to take it off. No obvious grip. This one's kind of interesting because not only does it have the flat sides to the tip, it actually has kind of a flat top as well. And this is a pretty pointy point, which means its one good use was as a tent stake. Now, the original No. 4 Mark I was made by Singer outside of Glasgow, Scotland, using the Mark SM. They were the only maker, and it was only made in 1941, and they made about 75,000. It was a single-piece forging, then it was machined to shape, and the same thing continued with the No. 4 Mark II here, which Singer continued making in Scotland. The change to delete the grooves was already made pretty early in 1941, because remember, this is deep in the war. And the whole reason they picked Singer to make the bayonets for the No. 4 rifle was because they felt it was outside the range of German bombers of the time, which, to be fair, it was. The Hinkel HE-111 didn't have the best range or payload in the world. So the Singer Mark IIs had the same markings, and they switched over production in very, very late 41, and they started to really get shipped out in 42 sometime. That's why there was only 75,000 of the Mark Is made. And they would switch over to this style here. Again, it's this whole single piece. It is forged and then machined steel. It originally had the code SM, but in 1943, the British government would introduce a distribution system with new codes, and Singer's would end up being N67. And the Mark I scabbard. This is a tube with a ball on the end. It does have a drain hole, and then it has a separate piece, a throat up here, which could be made out of a few different material types, although that same Zemac used in the butt plates was most often used. Less common, you would see steel or aluminium, and they experimented with brass, but it never really went into production. And then, of course, you have this canvas hanger. Some leather ones are out there too, but canvas was very much the norm. And this really was the standard scabbard, with millions made in the UK. Speaking of, Singer would keep on making these through the war, building roughly 1 million. But they were not the only manufacturers of the No. 4 Mark II. Again, they were the only makers of the No. 4 Mark I, but the Mark II was also made in North America, just like the No. 4 rifle. And we switch over to my wartime Long Branch Canadian No. 4 Mark I Star. And that's the change with the bolt release. They put a notch in the receiver and the bolt head rotates out. Other things could be different. These are most often found with the Mark II rear sight, which is about as simple gets in 1942. But you'll also find stamped parts, and also this one, for example, has the flat trigger. There's a lot of things, and again, butt plates can be different materials. This one has the stamp style front sight protector, but of course the same bayonet lug. And Long Branch would make these in Ontario, beginning in 42, late 41. And Savage in Massachusetts would make them beginning in 1941. And it's kind of interesting. As part of Lend-Lease, kind of going back. In fact, they used the same factory that New England Westinghouse, because at this time, Savage and Stevens had merged, or really Savage had bought out Stevens, making a single company, and a lot of stuff had been rolled together. Either way, Savage would ultimately build about 1,250,000, little less, rifles, but the contract ended in 1944. And Long Branch would actually build them until 1945 with war's end, but then resume under, frankly, a new name, Canadian Arsenals Limited, or Canadian Arsenals Long Branch. And around 1949, 1950, they would do another run of No. 4 Mark I stars for the upcoming Korean War, and that would be the final run, bringing their total to roughly 900,000. So North America, you're seeing a little over 2 million made, either for use by Canada or Britain. Even though they were marked U.S. property, for the Savage ones, they were not used by the U.S. directly. And of course, as they were making rifles, they also made bayonets. Here we have another example of a pig sticker. Note the flat sides, but the rounded top. Same basic bayonet. Long Branch would mark theirs LB. And between 1942 and 1944, they would build roughly 900,000, a little more. And then they would actually do another run for that Korean War, 5 or 6,000, now under the Canadian Arsenals name, which would be an A and a C. So their ultimate total was somewhere between 905 and 910,000, so just a few more bayonets than rifles. And Savage, too, would make some. They would build around 1.25 million themselves. And the Savage Mark IIs are kind of known for a little bit of rougher forging. They were still a forged bayonet, still perfectly durable. They just were more hastily done, but again, they were under time constraint and contract. And you do find Savages, they will have an S, sometimes in a box, sometimes not, sometimes written more squared off. So you have about 1 million, give or take, made in each area. And that is why the No. 4 Mark II bayonet is the most common for the No. 4 rifle, with 3 million or so made. And another scabbard, no hanger on this one. But we will get into some variations eventually. I think the Savage is kind of neat in the fact that the Long Branch Canadian Arsenals kept on being made. In fact, those are the final ones of this variation ever made in the world. And probably the most popular. But 1942, more is needed as they re-equip the British Army with No. 4 rifles. I mean, the whole idea behind this bayonet was to be simple and fast to produce. And they realized that they really didn't need firearms makers themselves to make the little sticker. Later on in 1942, it was decided that manufacturing really should be dispersed to try to limit supply shortages, bombing raids, whatnot. So the No. 4 Mark II Star was introduced. And it was a very similar device, except whereas this was a single piece forging, this was made up of 2 pieces that were forged together, and most often, but not 100% always, welded together. So that's why you see a step in the barrel here. I said barrel, but you know what I mean. It is kind of a barrel. Vacation video, folks. And sometimes you'll even have subcontractors making the socket. And these would be manufactured in England only, not in North America. And the primary maker would be Prince Smith in Yorkshire. They would build over 1,050,000 $50,000 between 1942 and 1945. And they were marked PSS, sometimes PSK, and they eventually would get the code N56. Perfectly well done, put together, and they were not a firearms maker or even anything related. They were actually in textiles and textile equipment before the war. But dispersion was the name of the game, although the other three makers were much smaller. For example, next we had H&B, Howard and Bulliff in Lancaster, and they would tool up in 42 and only make the Mark II Star and through 1943, and they would mark theirs H&B, and then later they would get the code N30, and they would build just over 160,000, which actually makes them the second largest maker, believe it or not. Yeah, pretty big leap there. Perhaps the smallest maker of the Mark II Star has the most interesting story. Lewisham Engineering in London was actually purpose assembled to make these bayonets, and it was actually done in a bombed-out sports club on the east side of London, and it was up and running by 1943, and they still only managed to produce about 85,000, even a little less, but it's an interesting story to try to keep bayonets a-flowing, and of course, all of these are interchangeable, even if they weren't appropriate, and they all got mixed up in service and whatnot. They used the L with an ENG for engineering, and they had the code S376. And our fourth maker is actually not in England proper. It was in Belfast, Northern Ireland, Baird Manufacturing. Between 1942 and 1944, they would build over 101,000 Mark II Stars. And this is kind of an interesting little example. For one, it has Arabic on the top, and those were known to have been used in Jordan and Iraq during and after the war. But Baird's also kind of interesting because they did things a little different. For one, they were known to have quite nice fit and finish. But for another, instead of welding the two pieces together, they actually used a pin, and then of course they ground the pin flush. And this one you can tell because the shaft is a little loose. This Bayonet's definitely seen some combat. The tip's bent and everything a little bit on it. But I think it's kind of cool for the been there, done that appearance, frankly. Yeah. I kind of like the Mark II, even though not all that many were made. About 1,300,000 to 1,400,000, give or take, all within the UK. Except there is talk of maybe a small number having been made in Belgium after the war, but these seem to be mysterious and no one really knows who and where they came from, so it's all speculation there. But pretty much the Mark II Stars production ended with World War II by 1944, 1945. As I mentioned, the Prince Smith was in the textiles, and H&B was into cotton equipment, and LENG was set up for it. And I actually don't know what Baird did before, but they weren't in manufacturing of firearms. And a lot of subcontractors made the sockets. even though the shaft and final assembly was done at those primary 4 plants. And with that, we've really hit the major notes. And actually, this one here is what inspired me to do this video, and was kind of a cool find recently in a local pawn shop. Meet the No.4 Mark III. And we'll talk about this scabbard in just a minute, too. In 1943, they looked for a way to further expedite production and also use maybe newer technologies in different factories. So this version was introduced. Often said to have a cast socket. I can understand. It looks like it. But the truth is, it's actually about 7 pieces of sheet steel, kind of crude stampings bent together, and then just kind of welded together in a blob fashion. Although the spike itself is still a forged piece. But then it's attached here. You can see this lip. You can inside see where it kind of rolls around at the bottom, and even the takedown button, the components in there are stamped. It's a different shape compared to every other one. Doesn't have this round piece so visible. I also noticed that the socket is slightly longer on this one compared to most of the others. Maybe you can see it here. It's a little more evident when it's on a rifle. I will say the edge is thinner because, again, it's a piece of sheet steel as well. Very interesting. It's also lighter. Like, picking this up, you can really tell this is a heavier piece back here compared with this. But these were only made for about a year, 1943 to 44, by Joseph Lucas in Birmingham. And while they would make nearly 200,000, that's quite obviously the smallest Mark itself, Mark III, they used the code M158. And basically, by the time these were really available to be shipped, the war had turned in favor of the Allies. So very few, if any, were issued. And in fact, because of the rather clutched together construction, this was the first version to be declared obsolete in 1946. But it is kind of the coolest version. So here we have them lined up. Again, don't have a Mark I. Oh well. Mark II, Mark II Star, and Mark III. Interestingly, the earliest one here is the most common. But what about the scabbard? Like I said, this is a No.4 Mark I scabbard. What's this thing? Well, it's known as the Mark V, or rather M5. But what the heck happened to Marks 2 through 4? All right. Going back here, #1. Pretty straightforward. Mostly the scabbard that you see made. There was a #2, and about 250,000 were made as a kind of test run, 1942, 1943, by Franco-British Electric Company. And it was a steel scabbard, but it was just straight walls, no curve in, thinner, lighter. I have to wonder if it was actually kind of a rolled steel design, because it came about the same time as the Mark III bayonet. Very uncommon today, and, you know, just one of those things they tried out. Sorry, I don't have one. It would directly lead to the Mark III scabbard, though, which was the same kind of cylindrical, straight scabbard shape, but made out of a plastic material. Now, some would say, rightfully so, this is be more considered Bakelite. True. Bakelite actually dates back to before World War I. Plastics, as we know them today, much later. However, they actually called this Victory Plastics, which is actually kind of an outgrowth of plexiglass from like bomber turrets. Now this, like I said, is an M5 or Mark V scabbard. The Mark III was cylindrical shaped, and this one, of course, has its own unique shape. Now, we don't really know where the Mark IIIs were made, or even how many were made. Some have speculated they might have come from Canada or even the USA. There are a few known, so we know they existed, but it was kind of another experiment. But these we know about, and I think this is a really cool scabbard. And yes, you know you're in a nerd video when those words are said. Cool scabbard. These were made in North America under Savage, although they actually used a subcontractor called Beckwith Manufacturing Company. And at this time, this plastic, as they called it, Victory Plastics, or Bakelite as we would know it today, was pretty advanced material. It was light and easy to form, and also something that set it apart. The frog is actually fixed on back here. Now, there are actually two variations of either press studs or rivets versus, on these others we've looked at throughout the video of just being held on with a frog stud. And to get them off, you just pull this down and slide it towards the bottom. But it won't come off the top because of the throat. These were shipped over Lend-Lease with Savage Mark II bayonets, but were used, of course, interchangeably throughout the war. Again, I don't know how many were made. We do know that quite a large number of Mark I scabbards came out of North America as well. I actually found these two together locally, the scabbard and the bayonet, and the minute I picked it up, I was super excited because this gave me a Mark III bayonet and a Mark V or M5 because it was from the US scabbard at one go. Do they exactly belong together? Yeah, maybe not, maybe. I don't know. Both are kind of wartime substitute standards. That's kind of where these scabbards were classified. And the Mark III bayonet itself was definitely a 1943 expedited thing. Either way, picking these up was pretty cool. Not that any of these are super valuable or collectible, but I find them interesting. And if you're wondering about the Mark IV or M4 scabbard, I keep wondering. I don't really know either. Considering the 2 and 3 were experimental, probably something along those lines. Or maybe it's what was used with the entrenching tool. There was a adapter that this could snap onto, this type of bayonet, to use it to poke around for landmines. So in addition to staking your tent, I guess you can use the No. 4 bayonet to poke around for landmines too. So it has a purpose. And in no particular organization, we have the No. 4 Mark I rifle up here, No. 4 Mark I Star, the long branch, and the post-war No. 4 Mark II, or rather No. 4 Mark I II because of the update. And I just randomly kind of stuck the bayonets on them, put the Mark III on the Canadian because it's the most simplified. This has the earliest, and this the latest. You can honestly see how the muzzle of the rifle protrudes just a little bit from the socket, but then on this one, the ring actually extends out just a little past the muzzle. Like I said, it's a little bit longer of a socket. So the evolution. And just as the bayonet changed and kind of was simplified through the war, so was the rifle. But then they started kind of adding things back, going to nicer butt plates. And then after the war, BSA would stop making No. 4s in 1947. And Fazakerly would actually introduce the No. 4 Mark II in 1949 and keep making them through at least 1955. I've even seen some that were commercially sold afterwards. And they would get the nicer things. Just as the Mark I had the spring-loaded release, and then the Star had the bolt release kind of as a notch. The big mechanical difference with the Mark II was moving the trigger to hang from the receiver versus trigger guard. There's other many changes, including having the finely adjustable rear sights, but that's not really what makes a Mark II. It's the mechanical change that usually designates. And of course, there were other things, the nicer wood, machined parts. And they would build roughly 5 million No. 4 bayonets of all marks, again with the Mark II being by far the most common, Mark I's being rare, and not a ton of Mark III's being made either. And then, of course, the balance being Mark II Stars. But unless you were going camping, there wasn't a whole lot of use for them. And that actually led to its de facto replacement, even though it was a little bit of an accident at first. This was a replacement for this, although the hanger stayed the same. Essentially, what they did, they took the socket for the bayonet No. 4 and combined it with the blade from the bayonet No. 5, the so-called jungle carbine. And of course, by extension, it used the same scabbard. So it's about the same overall length, kind of a Bowie clip point blade with a fuller or blood groove if you prefer. And was something that the British troops and even powers that be really wanted since the end of World War II. The old spiker here, the old socket style, but just wasn't that popular. The overall reach, the same. But at least having a blade, even if it didn't have a handle or grip as such, helped. Of course, there was, the No. 7 Land Forces knife/bayonet. I had one of those 2 years ago. I really didn't like it, and they got to be too valuable, so away it went. It's fine. And this, of course, was also used on the Sten Mark V submachine gun. I should point out that late in World War II, Britain dropped the Roman numeral system, I, and went to just straight Arabic numerals. So just as this became the No. 4 Mark II, this was the actual bayonet No. 9 Mark I. And here we have two makers. Up here is an original pool. These were introduced in 1947 and built through about 49. They made a little over 200,000. That was the first run. In fact, these were so desperately wanted that they really started producing them before they'd even been fully adopted. And then here's a later style. These were made by primarily Enfield from 49 to 56, and another small run in early 60s. Fazakerly would also do some to be sold with their contract guns, like the Irish contract. And actually, South Africa did an interesting variant that I just saw one the other day. They essentially took an Uzi blade and attached it to a No.4 socket. But this video is not really on this bayonet. I just wanted to point out the replacement. They did also make them in Canada, Pakistan, and a couple of private manufacturers would make it in the UK. And this blade itself would be repeated for decades, including with the L1A1, and not really being dropped until the L85 bullpup in the 1980s, early 90s. And you can understand why it was a little more attractive and a little more useful. A little heavier too. A little chunkier scabbard. But in a lot of ways improved the rifle, as much as any bayonet does in the 20th century. And that's about it, folks. I just wanted to kind of add a little more information with a couple more bayonets for the No.4 Spiker. Again, I kind of wish I still had the No.4 Mark I just to complete the set, but on the other hand, it did well as far as finances, so I can't really complain about that. Sold it a long time ago now. You know, can't keep everything, such as life. But as much as bayonets are a bit of a niche topic, I think they're interesting if you can get into them right, and these are still quite affordable, anywhere from $25 to $40 with scabbard and frog when you find them. And this one is particularly neat, I think. This was a local, as I said, and it's kind of what inspired me to do this add-on video. Besides, I'm on vacation, so hey, I'm allowed to do kind of nerdy, esoteric videos, right? And even if only a few people watch this, hope you enjoyed as much as I do, because this is really what I do like about firearms. This kind of stuff right here. Just getting into the nitty-gritty, not having to spend a lot of money, but just finding things in pawn shops. Wear and tear, honest aging, all good stuff. Anyway, hope everyone is doing well this August. If you'd like to help support the channel, please check out Patreon. And starting to do live streams again. And we'll be back with regular range videos here in a few weeks. But in the interim, please check out some of the older videos. I'm sure there's a few you haven't seen yet. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.